I will just first introduce myself. My name is Jason. I'm a junior at CMC, majoring in psychology and philosophy of a data science sequence. I really came to CMC for its close professor-student interaction and its high caliber of research for a small liberal art college. And in the past 3 years, I've been quite fortunate to experience all of this and more. I've been quite involved with the academic communities here, kind of working with several labs, including Professor Zhou's lab, but also department and research institution. And I've gotten multiple opportunities to kind of serve my communities, right? Whether or not being the psychology club president or TA, actually, for Professor Zhou as well. So I'm very grateful for my time here, being kind of honored to moderate this discussion. I think the research is interesting and it would be great benefit for all of the CMC alumni. And while there, for me personally, this could be multiple paths for me in the future, I will definitely remember my time here. So short introduction out of the way, just reminding of some housekeeping items. So Zoom etiquette stuff, really quickly, just one, keep yourself muted. And if most importantly, during the Q&A session, if you have a question, please just send it in the chat or send it to Rebecca, and I or Rebecca will relay it to you. And Rebecca's the one waving her hand right there. All right, so let's introduce the main stage, the main person for this event, Professor Zhou. So Professor Zhou here is a new assistant professor of the psychological science at CMC. He earned his PhD in the organization psychology from George Mason University with a certificate in computational social science, but he also has a variety of industry experience working in things like HR, nonprofit management, and institutional data analysis. So Professor Zhou's research and teaching really focus on this quantitative method and the data science applied to organizational phenomenon such as leadership, personality, and career development. And he employs methods of a variety of advanced statistical technique, from traditional multivariate statistic and structured equational modeling to more modern techniques such as natural language processing and generative AI. But importantly, he also has an eye of applying his high quality research beyond kind of the ivory tower of academia into to make a real world impact in everyday leaders, managers, and employers. And definitely in his talks, you will see a lot of that. So that's the introduction over. And Professor Zhou, if you can share your screen. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you, everyone, for attending this. I'm so excited to get to present a little bit about what I get to do for a job here at CMC, which is amazing. And thank you, Jason, for the kind introduction. You know, this speaks to the quality of students we have here. I sent Jason over just a couple of bullet point notes about for bio, and he expanded on that to what you heard just now. And to Jason's point, he has interacted with me several times in amazing ways. I remember he was actually my interview almost a year ago to this day as one of the student interviewers. And then not more than a couple months after I was officially hired back in the spring, he reaches out to me via email before I'm even officially at CMC, and emails asking, hey, what are you going to be doing at CMC? I'd love to get involved. And so now Jason is my TA for my intro stats class and is involved in my research lab. So thank you, Jason. Really glad to get to know students like yourself. That's really one of the best things about CMC are the students here. So I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes or so talking about my overall research portfolio and going pretty high level over some of the different research projects and teaching that I'm involved in to give people an idea and a taste of the things that we do at CMC. And I'll leave behind some takeaways, some ways that actually I hope alumni and parents in the community could get involved in some ways. So I'll leave that behind at the end. And of course, if you have questions, as Jason said, please feel free to put those into the chat, and there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions. So to start, I'll do a brief introduction of myself in terms of my background. So I started with my undergraduate at Pepperdine University. So I am local to the Southern California area. So we were just talking about that earlier. When I moved back to LA, I knew what I was getting myself into in terms of California weather and expense and all of that other stuff. But then I spent a couple of years working in human resource analytics for HelloFresh, the meal kit delivery company. So we were using data science and visualization to show time to hire, performance metrics, and things like that. I went to George Mason University in Virginia on the East Coast for my PhD. While I was there, in addition to the PhD, I worked in the provost's office. I did some work with graduate student affairs. That led me on a brief detour for a year at Purdue, working in their institutional data office, so pursuing data science at an institutional level. I oversaw all the surveys at Purdue, actually. So like 50,000 students were responding to surveys every couple of weeks, and we were analyzing and visualizing all those data. And I did some nonprofit consulting most recently at an organization for a nonprofit where I oversaw the business operations, about a $2 million budget, and staff for succession planning and leadership planning for a nonprofit. And I say all of that to emphasize that hopefully what you hear throughout my presentation is this theme of the scientist practitioner model, which is something we say a lot in organizational psychology, which broadly speaking is the study of how people think and behave in organizational settings. And we say scientist practitioner because we're doing scientific research to understand those concepts. We're also trying to put them into play. We're trying to practice them in real world organizations, which is where you all come in. So I'll mention that at the end. Let me start with an overview of my research agenda. So I've named my research lab the Stats Lab, largely because I couldn't really come up with a better acronym. We, for some reason, really like acronyms in academia. So I was trying to come up with a clever one, and I decided I'll just stick with stats, and I'll call it, like, I think I came up with some acronyms using GPT of students testing analytics, theories, and science. And then I also decided sometimes, research doesn't work out very well, so we'll just add that. On those days, we'll say the acronym stands for some theories are totally spurious. That's what I decided. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, right? But in the stats lab, I have this nice little figure to show what I do. The content areas, in terms of what are the organizational phenomena we try to understand, I'm most interested in leadership, career development, teamwork, and personality. I want to understand, what does it mean to be a good leader? What does it mean to have a good career? What does it mean to work on a good team? And how is personality a factor in all of this? To approach those content areas, I use 3 overlapping methodological approaches. On one hand, I've actually engaged in some qualitative theory-based work on the bottom left. That's all about, well, the world of work is changing. So how do we update our theories? And how do we think qualitatively about what we understand leadership to be, given that the world is changing? But then I also use traditional statistical measurement. As Jason mentioned, these are traditional psychometrics, factor analysis, structural equation models, these things that people probably haven't heard of, but they use fancy math, as I say it, to allow us to estimate things that we can't physically measure. I think that's one of the beauties of the field that I'm in, that when I say I care about leadership, we all know leadership exists. We all know good and bad leaders exist, but you can't go physically take a ruler to measure a leader. So how do we use surveys and how do we use fancy math to try to estimate what that is? And on the bottom right, I use the term alphabet soup to refer to machine learning, artificial intelligence, natural language processing, large language models, generated GPT process transformers, and agent-based modeling. Basically, all the different modern data science approaches to try to explore this complex world of organization. And then the final piece of this puzzle is I'm very interested in not only conducting this research, but researching how the research is conducted and how it's then translated to the real world. Broadly speaking, I call that meta science. Some people call it science communication, scientist practitioner gap. The idea is I want to know that we're doing research that matters, that is ethical, that is accurate, and that is actually translatable to people who are probably listening on this call thinking about, I work on a team and I don't like it. How are you going to help me? So that's the overview of my research area. I'm going to zoom in now on some specific studies to just explain and give a taste of the type of research that I do. And I'll start with studies that I've already done or are largely in progress, and then I'll go to some studies that I've just started here at CMC, featuring some of our own CMC students. The first piece has to do with the fact that leadership, as I hinted at, is so important, but is so complex and actually quite difficult to define. I really like this book. It's a tongue-in-cheek book that's titled Leadership, 700 Definitions and Ways to Lead. And what the author is getting at is this idea of there are different leaders out there, but there are so many different theories and approaches and frameworks and books on what defines a good leader. In the business world, many of you have probably read books like Good to Great, Transformational Leadership, and things like that. Over in the academic world, we've got all sorts of theories ranging from ethical leadership to authentic leadership, which is kind of a hot topic in businesses nowadays, to my understanding. And there's all these definitions. And I think the reason that leadership is so complex is because you have complex individuals. You start with the fact that every individual is complex, whether that's personality, that's background, training, functional experience and expertise, leading complex teams. You put a complex leader in a complex situation where it's not just a simple, this is the answer, but you have a bunch of complex people working together to try to figure out what's the best way to solve a problem. And then across complex time, the same leadership behavior or function is not going to work at this moment in time versus a month later, depending on where your company's at, depending on where the economy is at, depending on where politics are at. And the reason I start with this is because it illustrates why the title of the talk is Leadership Meets Data Science, and why most of my research belongs in this question of how do we measure this? How do we try to quantify and empirically study something that is so naturally complex and difficult to isolate down to this good thing will lead to this good thing? My argument is that we have to take a multi-pronged approach. We had to combine a bunch of different methodological tools, which is why my slide had an alphabet soup on it, realizing that no one study is going to capture everything and is going to explain everything. And so I don't try to do that. I don't believe that any one study that I produce or anybody produces is going to solve leadership. But I sometimes use that analogy of the elephant where people are touching different parts of the elephant, right? If leadership is an elephant, then you might be able to get a study that gets at the ear or gets at the tail or gets at the trunk, that gets to see a slice of what leadership looks like in this moment, in this time, with this team, and with this methodology. And over time, over an aggregation of many, many different studies, we might be able to get a better picture and a better understanding of leadership. So I'm going to talk about, here's 3 different categories of research, and I'm going to zoom in on a couple of specific studies. So I have studies, as I said, under the statistical measurement piece. This is using traditional multivariate bifactor analyses, multidimensional forced choice surveys to try to understand what leadership is. And again, in just a moment, I'm going to zoom in to talk about a specific study. I'm then going to talk about alphabet soup. I've got some studies using natural language processing to analyze leader surveys, GPT to rate public figures on leadership. I'm working on building an escape room, which I'll talk about in a moment, to map communication networks within a leadership and leadership team. And my dissertation was on age-based modeling to simulate how shared leadership functions and potentially the times in shared leadership does not work out so well. And then I'm going to talk about modern theories and qualitative methods, including a project that I did interviewing chiefs of staff to explore what does leadership look like in this relatively new role. I say new to businesses because it's been around in government and military for many, many years, and other behavioral processes that lead to effective shared leadership. So let me zoom in on this study here. So I said this word very quickly, and most of you probably were like, what did you just say? Multidimensional forced choice surveys are very interesting because traditional surveys are what we call Likert type measures, which you've probably seen before, because they ask, to what extent do you agree or disagree on a scale of 1 to 5 to each of these statements? At work, I get my tasks done right away, or I feel comfortable around people. You probably have taken these surveys yourself, whether it's because a supervisor asked you to, or a teammate asked you to, or you were just on BuzzFeed looking around and found a funny survey that you want to take. Now, we have known for decades that these surveys have a lot of problems with them. Most notably, that it's really easy to fake on them, meaning if you knew you were taking this survey and it was being used to assess your leadership for maybe not a promotion, but maybe like a leadership development class or something like that, you're likely to to be biased in how you score yourself. You might fake in the sense of presenting yourself as strong as possible. And in some ways, that's not a bad thing. We all want to present ourselves as best as possible when it comes to a job interview or it comes to some sort of selection process. And so it's very easy to just answer 5 out of 5 on all of these things. Well, more recently, forced choice measures, multidimensional forced choice, they force participants to rank order the statements. So instead of saying on a scale of 1 to 5 for each of these, they say which of these statements is most descriptive of who you are. And this just naturally prevents people from rating themselves top on everything, because if we're ranked, no, I am more likely to get tasks done and less likely to feel comfortable around people. To be clear, there's been some pros and cons to this. My previous research in this area has focused on testing existing measures, largely on personality, which were popularized about a decade ago. Some of you might be aware of something called the Strengths Finder. It's a popular personality and teamwork assessment test. it uses forced choice methodology. And so I've done some publications looking at gender differences, looking at order effects, and then a review of 80 years of research on forced choice methodology, which summarizes some of those pros and cons, that it really does reduce faking, but at the same time, people don't like them as much. They tend to get annoyed when they're forced to choose between I get work done and I like being around people. So it's got some pros and cons to each of those. And I've got a couple projects right now here developing more forced choice surveys for leader behaviors, focusing on the big four ones that are popular in at least the research literature today. Task leadership, meaning you tell people what to do. Relationship-oriented leadership, meaning you encourage people, make them feel part of the team. Change or charismatic leadership, that you set a vision and get people enthusiastic towards the vision. And ethical leadership, holding ethical lines to say, this is how we're supposed to get things done here. I'm also interested in applying this to something called vocational interests, which is a model of what people are interested in vocationally. That ranges from realistic, so some people are more interested in just getting things done physically with their hands. Others are interested in investigating. Others are more artistic or social or conventional. A second area of research, a specific example of a research project, again, all under this umbrella of how do we measure this complex idea of leadership, has to do using natural language processing of leader survey measures. There are many, many leadership surveys out there, and we systematically extracted over 400 survey items. And that was 400 from popular, published, validated leader surveys. These are ones that have been used for decades in the research literature, and we grabbed those 400 items. And what we were interested in exploring, here's just an example of some of them. I'm easy to understand, is willing to make changes, emphasizing the importance of a collective sense of mission. And we're using some natural language processing, specifically contrastive learning with some transformer-based sentence embedding, yay, fancy words here. But the point is, we want to see is if there's sufficient semantic separation between leadership constructs based on these survey items. Meaning, we got 400 different items, and they claim to measure 10 different leader constructs, variables of leadership, or types of leadership, if you will. Then semantically, in terms of the meaning of those survey items, we should see 10 distinct clusters. We should see clusters where if you're trying to measure ethical leadership, then those vocabulary terms, those items, should hang together in terms of what they're referencing from a natural language process. And at the same time, we want to see, well, what if we take an unsupervised learning approach, which means we don't tell you there's 10 clusters, and we want to see how many clusters actually appear based on those semantic meaning clusters. And this is an in-progress study, so we're in the middle of this right now, and we're getting about 2/3 of the way through right now. But one of the interesting findings, just to preview it, is if you look on the left here, what we did was we took items from the International Personality Pool, which is a large pool of personality items that have been developed for many decades now, and we applied this method, and you can see how there are clearly 5 distinct clusters which map onto the 5 different theoretical clusters they were supposed to measure. The items clearly hang together in semantic meaning based on these different colors here. Hopefully you can kind of see that on the left. But over on the right, here's where we took 5 leadership clusters. So the colors represent theoretically, they're supposed to measure these types of leadership, but you can see the items are all messy and cluster, and they're all mashed together. They're not very distinct in what they're measuring semantically. So the argument we're making here is that we claim to be using these items to study 5 different leadership types, but when we look at the natural language and the semantic meaning behind these items, they're not as distinct as we might argue that they are. And then the last project I want to zoom in on before I talk about some new projects that I started here at CMC is the Chief of Staff role that I mentioned. So we looked into the Chief of Staff role. This was about a year ago, and specifically in corporate strategy roles as opposed to military or government. And we scraped 2,500 LinkedIn profiles, did some surveys, and did actually some in-depth interviews. And we came up with some interesting theories of what the Chief of Staff does. And these are theories. These are relatively untested, meaning we're proposing a new research stream. So again, this paper was published about a year ago. We're working on some follow-up projects, trying to get it off the ground to really spur on more research and understanding the Chief of Staff role. And briefly, we found some interesting tidbits of future research and information where the Chief of Staff functions in this interesting in-between area between the CEO and the top management team that really has to do with how the top management team behaves together, behavioral integration, and relates to one another, the relational network. We also found interesting evidence of the chief of staff really leading from behind the scenes. And then we had this fun phrase that kept coming up, predictable unpredictability. And everyone was talking about how unpredictable the job of chief of staff was, and it's predictable that it's unpredictable. We also found some interesting things about contending against common misconceptions. That the chief of staff is not just an executive assistant EA over him. So we raised some potential future research questions, apologies, asking about what impact does this chief of staff have on the CEO itself? How do they influence overall outcomes? How are they hired? And when are they hired? When does a company need a chief of staff? At what point in their scale and their growth do they hire a chief of staff? And then what is the chief of staff as a career? What are some of the predictors and long-term outcomes for the chief of staff career? So those are some of our research questions that we're looking into exploring right now. Let me shift gears a little bit and talk about some interesting research that I started here at CMC. The CMC marketing department kindly sent over a photographer a couple weeks ago and took some photos of lab meetings that we had. So we had a great lively lab meeting discussion. I really love the students here. You can see that, well, you can't see that they're engaged, but I promise they were engaged and had lots to say about the topic. In this case, we were actually discussing publishing ethics in this particular meeting. And I'll give you 3 studies that we have started and are just in progress working with CMC students here. The first is, I hinted at earlier, using escape rooms to study leadership and teamwork. By capturing detailed audio and visual data from teams working together to complete an escape room, we're trying to see, can we use those communication patterns in a social network to show who emerges as a leader? What I have is I've got set up these individual microphones for every player on an escape room. And by the way, for those who don't know, escape rooms have been somewhat popular in the past decade or so, where a group of people go into an escape room, they're not actually locked in. I have to say that because I don't want to get in trouble for saying, hey, you're locking people into a room for research. I'm not. They can leave at any time, but the game is to pretend you're locked in, right? And you're working together to solve puzzles to exit the room. And these puzzles require teamwork. One of my favorite puzzles is an example of one where it's one of those simple remote controlled cars, but the remote is chained up in a corner of the room such that whoever's controlling the remote can't see the car in another room. And they have to have a teammate stand over at the other room and yell over instructions on drive left, drive right, drive straight to control the car to do something. Just some simple examples of how it really elicits teamwork in a setting that's very controlled, which is what we as researchers really want, and is engaging. Because one of the hardest things to do about research in my field is getting people to actually want to participate in our studies. And so this is a great example of people actually pay to go to an escape room. So it would be so much easier to convince people to participate in a study if we're telling them, come to an escape room, get some fun activities going on, perhaps even learn a little bit about how you function as a team, and hey, give us some data we can use to study some interesting things. So those individual microphones and the 360 camera to be able to capture who's saying what, who's talking to whom, and that allows us to see over time, over the course of an hour, usually in a game, does it show who emerges as a leader? Is that influenced by the pre-existing structure? If one of those leaders is the boss of the team in the workplace environment, or if they're all strangers, the other factors have to do here, or other factors at play here as well. The photo, by the way, is of me taking some of my students in my lab to go play an escape room a couple of weeks ago as a kickoff to this research project. We did escape, and we were able to, I guess, draw a photo of one of us to escape. That's the little horrible drawing that's right there sitting in the photo. Another idea of using escape rooms has to do with testing the use of AI bots as team members. You might be familiar with lots of interest today on AI and human AI teams. The idea of having an AI as part of a team doing functions to help with the team, to help the teamwork. And in escape rooms, there's often like a helper. You can ask for help, a clue if you get stumped. And we're interested in seeing if participants know that that's an AI bot providing help. What predicts the likelihood of them actually referring to the AI bot for help? Does it have to do with their trust with AI, with their trust in each other, with the quality of AI, and so forth? The second of 3 projects I want to cover that I'm working with, this one's thanks to the Kravis Leadership Institute, and I'm partnering with them with some of their students, pictured here, 2 of them pictured here, to look at this very, very recent phenomenon of digital AI twins. It's this recent use where they would collect detailed data on real humans, on their background, personality, experiences, and so forth, and put it into a fine-tuned large language model to develop a digital AI twin. So literally, we're trying to clone someone like Jason based on his responses to 2,000 questions about his background and personality to see how would an LLM pretending to be Jason react in certain situations. This is very recent research that people are developing and trying out and asking very important questions on the ethics of it and the privacy. There's so many important questions here. The one slice of this that I'm trying to explore with these students at Kravis is to look at the idea of pilot testing leader development programs. There are lots of leader development programs out there, and anyone who's tried to run a program knows just how hard it is to pilot test. Now, I keep saying that because we're not trying to replace, we're not trying to say, oh, go use the AI clones to do leader development. That makes no sense, that we're not literally not developing them. But we can pilot test. We can suggest, does this work? Work in the sense of, is it understandable? Do we have the right question prompts and reflection prompts? Do we get at least reactions that suggest that someone like Jason would actually appreciate the questions we're asking in this leader development program? So to be clear, we're not trying to replace human participants in leader development. We're just trying to simplify the pilot testing process to make it more efficient and cheaper and scale quicker to actual testing with human participants on leader development. And the third project that I'm working on is using natural language processing to predict leader and team performance based on transcripts from the Survivor TV show. I like to inject a little bit of just personal experience and fun on this. So I've never been on the Survivor TV show, sadly, but I have been on local chapters like Survivor DC when I was a PhD student over in the DC area. There was like a one-day Survivor game. I won't tell you how I did on that game because I made some stupid mistakes. That's okay. But the idea is we have access to the subtitle transcripts from all of these TV shows, which means with a little bit of cleaning, we can use natural language processing to extract language-based parameters such as sentiment and emotion and semantics and use of team-based vocabulary. And from that, can we then predict their performance in an environment that's actually a real high-stakes, real-world lab of teamwork? These are real individuals working in teams to try to, high stakes, like they're literally trying to compete for $1 million. Of course, this is not supposed to replicate real business scenarios. Business scenarios are not Survivor, but it's a step towards trying to improve how we study real world complex situations rather than relying on some survey data. So these are 3 projects that I've been working on with new students here, all in this realm of leadership and measurement, leadership and data science. I'm going to spend the last portion of this, last 10 minutes or so, I want to spend a few minutes first talking about some other topics that are related. So it still connects to what I'm talking about, but it's not explicitly about leadership. So I do some research in careers, and I mentioned meta science. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these areas, and then I'll end with the type of work that we do in terms of application and consulting, and of course, teaching. And those are ways that I hope some people on this call might be interested in getting involved with. In terms of careers, a motivating factor behind several studies in this chain is this phrase, find the job you're called to do and you never have to work a day in your life. People have probably heard that before. It's a bit of a riff off of a Mark Twain quote. And it's just this idea of let's hope people find their calling, their vocational calling, and pursue it and find that job, and yay, we're happy. Well, some of you might agree with me here that it's not that simple. Vocational calling is a lot more complex than this. First of all, it's already complex to define. It's a deeply felt sense of purpose, a deeply felt sense of calling to a particular work or job, and often as a response to a personal sense of identity or even an external sense of I'm supposed to be doing this for the world. But it's very hard to define, which already causes complications on measurement. And the research most recently in the past decade or so has shown that it has both positive and negative effects. For a long time, it was really just the positive. It was focusing on find a calling, and you're good to go. And now it's showing, and there was a really cool study showing that it's actually one of the best meta-analyses on this is that if you have a calling and you feel like you're not meeting that calling, you're actually worse off in terms of different satisfaction outcomes and happiness than if you felt like you had no purpose at all, which is a fascinating finding and really points to that it's not just about identifying calling, it's also finding a way to live it out in a meaningful way that's also realistic. Some of the research here has been focused on areas like healthcare and musicians and social work, areas that we know people tend to feel called to, but in terms of industry and economics are often very hard to find a successful career in. I should say objectively successful in terms of income. So one study that I did that was a couple of years ago and that kicking off several research areas is this idea of let's first change our definition of calling. And let's shift from a traditional definition of a narrow calling to a specific job and instead broaden it. Let's say you're not called, let's try to encourage people to say, it's not that I'm called to be a top 5 bluegrass musician, it's I'm called to provide music more broadly. And let's shift from long term to short term. Instead of saying, I'm called to this, and let's assume I'm called for the rest of my life, it's I'm called to this career path for 5 years, 10 years, maybe even just 1 year. Meaning there's flexibility to shift in your calling over time. And then the third one is let's not assume that if you're called to something, you need to find that job right away, immediately. That calling might be more distal in time, meaning you might feel called to it, but it's not for another 5 or 10 years that you actually find yourself in a position to be able to pursue that call. And so we encourage in this theory paper that we wrote that people should engage in more career flexibility, moving towards a broader, shorter term, more distal calling. That's a theory paper that we published a couple of years ago that's spurring on some ongoing research. And then the other thing that just came out actually is a book that we just published a couple months ago with Cambridge Press that's about the first job. How do people find their first job and how does that relate to their sense of calling? We interviewed 62 people about their stories. We learned about their winding paths, their rough waters, and the unexpected turns that shaped their search for that very first job out of high school, college, grad even. And this is an anthology that brings together the authentic firsthand accounts of these journeys, coupled with a cutting-edge review of the research in vocational psychology. And I can send this out after for those who are interested, no pressure, but I put a link for discount to buy the book on my website. And to be clear, first of all, we don't make money off of books in academia, sadly. And second of all proceeds go towards funding future student research. So there's not a promotion for myself. This is just if people are interested. We do hope that this book really helps individuals as they graduate high school or college or even grad school and think about what their calling is and how to pursue that as they exit and search for their first role. In terms of ongoing research in this area, I'm really grateful for the Gold Center in particular at CMC, who has funded 2 student research assistants, pictured here, looking at 2 different research projects. The first is proposing a model of multiple calling. What happens if with individuals who might identify that they feel called to 2 completely different career paths? And what happens if those callings create tension or conflict? Or they actually converge and have synergy with one another to support career development. And the second project is we want to qualitatively study how callings form prior to adult working lives. There are people who come into college or graduate high school feeling like they're called to a career path already. What led them there? What happened prior to the age of 18? And in particular, we're interested in parental influences and cultural influences that shaped their identification of a calling, or even the fact that they feel like they have a calling. What are those influences there? So we're working on gearing up for interviews in the spring to understand that. So that's one area that's kind of tangentially related to my research on leadership and data science. And then the last area that I wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about is meta-science. So the study of how we do and communicate scientific research. I start by saying that there's a lot of problems with scientific research. It weighs ethical dilemmas that are actually surprisingly widespread that people who aren't in the nitty-gritty details of academia might not be aware of. They range from this phrase, researcher degrees of freedom, this idea that as a researcher, there's actually multiple ways to conduct a study, whether that's how you collect your data or how you analyze your data or how you interpret your data. And those degrees of freedom can actually trigger some ethical questions on what do you report to the public or to the journal in terms of what you found when you've got hundreds of different findings, all from different types of analysis, and you got to choose one or two to simplify down to. That's one way. And another way has to do with incentives. If you know anything about a faculty career, a lot of what we do is incentivized based on how much we publish. And that creates, in some instances, a phrase that we call publish or perish culture that can create some interesting corruptions that force faculty to honestly cut some corners in order to publish. And I am really trying to zoom in on that to show that this can happen and to create and improve the faculty working climate so that it reduces those types of incentives to really make for better ethics in how we do research. My research has primarily focused on how do we communicate that science? How do we make sure science benefits people that we were trying to help in the first place? That's exemplified by an article we published last year, where we looked at all of our research on leadership and teams, and we asked the question of, does this apply to small businesses? Because our argument is most of the research in our area has been either collecting data from large businesses, because those are the ones that can actually give us data, or they're promoting practical implications and recommendations that are really only possible if you have the resources to implement those recommendations. And so we looked at these research articles in leadership and teams, and we actually gave them to small business owners and asked them, is this helpful? And unsurprisingly, the answer was largely no, this is not helpful. So we raised the big question in our field asking, are we actually helping small businesses that make up something like 50% of people in organizations today in the US? The other project I'm working on, this is a Zoom call I was on with the students here at CMC. It's just getting started, but we're working on an experiment to study what we call predatory journals. These are fake academic journals that charge authors money to publish their articles with little to no scientific review. And if you've read Inside Higher Ed or Chronicle of Higher Ed recently, there's actually been quite a few news articles coming out in the past few months that have shown a spotlight on this and show that this is actually rising in terms of people engaging in predatory journals, sometimes unknowingly in the first place. It's not that faculty are trying to do this, it's that sometimes people don't even know that these predatory journals exist. So our primary question is if people know about this, because it's such a more recent development. We want to know if students, faculty, journalists who are writing news articles, or even just the general public know what these are, can recognize and distinguish them from reputable journals, and if this leads to downstream negative effects on science communication. Now, it may feel like I'm making it sound like academia is a horrible place. It's not, otherwise I wouldn't be in a career in academia. So let me give you some potential bright futures that I'm involved in. One of which is the many labs approach. A lot of people in the social sciences, especially in organizational psychology, are now focusing on globalized large-scale data collection to be able to see how a specific phenomenon occurs outside of just the US and can be replicated across dozens, if not hundreds, of research labs, all trying to do analysis the same way to maintain a high standard of ethics and to show that our research is generalizable outside of a small lab. We actually are so excited to announce one of our papers is now in press at Nature, one of the largest journals in scientific research. It was 100 studies that were published in about the past 10 years, as when we started the study, that I was on a team of 500 analysts to reanalyze their data to see, does it replicate? 74% of the reanalyses led to the same results, which is very encouraging. But what's a little bit shocking and concerning is that 24% were inconclusive, meaning we couldn't exactly replicate the findings, meaning there was something changed that led to a slightly different result. And then 2% led to completely contradictory results in the first place, which is actually a little bit scary. Another group I'm working with, this one I'm on the leadership team for, is Psych Science Accelerator, and this intersects with my leadership interests. So we're studying linguistic biases and the association between gender and leadership. And we've just finished collecting data from 23,000 participants across 44 countries to address this question in 40 plus, I think it was almost 50 different research labs across 44 countries to study the same question with the same methods to show that this finding can replicate across all of these countries. And then the final thing I'm going to share, I know I went through a lot of different studies, but there's a lot of fun things happening. You can see how excited I am to be here to pursue these. But thanks to some generous funding from the Lowell Institute here at CMC, I'm working with a first-year student to investigate the social network of who writes papers with whom. How do faculty co-author with one another? And here's a preview. We pulled some research, about 400 articles on a specific research topic, actually forced choice methodology. There's not too many authors writing about it. And each of these circles represents a faculty author. The size represents how many times they've published. And each line represents an instance where a faculty co-authored a paper with another faculty. And you can see some interesting situations where you have a main cluster right here in the center of faculty who constantly write with one another on this topic. But the vast majority of faculty don't write with one another. And this presents a very interesting view on how research is spread, who disseminates knowledge, how do we work with one another, and are we communicating cross-disciplinary boundaries to be able to do science better? We have an abstract right now accepted by Perspectives on Psych Science, which is a really exciting journal in the psychological sciences, and we're gearing up for the full paper that's actually due in a month and a day from now, so I need to crank that paper out as fast as possible. All right, let me end with 2 final slides here. Walking the talk. I hope that everything I do, that my lab does, that we as academia, as faculty do, is for the betterment of society. That means communicating our research and applying it to improve the lives of everyday managers, leaders, and employees wherever we can. Some ways, so historically, I've done that through nonprofit consulting. Having moved to the LA area recently, I'm working on rebuilding my personal networks here. But some of the ways I'm involved, I'll be one of the faculty mentors for the data science capstone at CMC. So big promo here. If you have an organization that could use some senior data science students to provide consulting to do a data science project for you, this is a really cool program we have here at CMC where we get our senior capstone students to do a data science project with a faculty mentor. We've had really successful clients in the past that some names I'm not even allowed to say apparently because of non-disclosure agreements. And of course, we treat data privacy to the highest standard as possible. But the idea is we can provide data science consulting, and maybe there's a small project that your organization is working on that you could use extra hand on. So please reach out if you're interested in that. I regularly write. I've got a newsletter active on LinkedIn. Please find me there and follow. I'm regularly communicating not just my own research, but also other people's research. I write research reviews promoting research that I think is not only interesting, but relevant to everyday managers, and of course, promoting my students and what they do. And I've also had the fortune of participating in groups. This one is one of my favorites that I recommend to academics everywhere. So if you're faculty on this call, Beyond the Ivory Tower is a workshop led by a New York Times op-ed editor that trains faculty specifically to write for public press. I was able to participate in that last year, which really helped give me some tools on how to write outside of academia. And then the final slide I'll have here is classes. So if you're a parent on this call and you've got students at CMC right now or in the Claremont colleges in general, please consider encouraging them to take classes with me. I'd love to have your students, your family members in the class. So I teach organizational psychology, which is the intro class for organizational topics. I teach intro statistics for psychology, which is the intro class for statistics. That one I'm teaching in the spring. And then I have developed and just got approved to teach a new advanced stats class here at CMC, which covers factor analyses, structural equation modeling, cluster analysis. It's an elective for psychology and data science majors, and that's this spring. Enrollment is happening right now, so please encourage your students to register for that class. And then I'm really excited, next year I'll be teaching a new class that also just got approved. It's a seminar on careers. So we'll be able to talk about advanced theories and careers and vocational development in this discussion-based seminar. And with that, at exactly 30 minutes, I think, or 35, please stay in touch. There's a QR code. And the ways to get involved, like I said, encourage students to take my classes, connect with us for data analysis and consulting opportunities. Shameless plug here. Look, we can only do research because we can fund our students to work on research projects and go to conferences and, of course, pay for data and other research expenses. So please consider doing that. I'm so grateful for the funding that CMC has provided to be able to provide for students to participate in research. So please consider that. And above all, just spread the word about the exciting things happening, not just in my lab, but at CMC in general, because there are so many cool things happening at CMC. And please tell the world about it. So with that, thank you so much. And I'm excited to answer some questions and have some conversation here.
Yeah, thank you for the Wonderful presentation, Professor Zhou. Yeah, and just a reminder, just please enter the questions in the chat. I will just do that. And because somebody has already, first question I have is from Art, right? Art Dots. And they ask, continuing kind of the elephant analogy you brought in earlier, they're interested in how does kind of one pursue more unique features of like the elephant, but like the leadership, such as like the tusk, its makeup, and its role. And there's like a more unique element of leadership lead to a better understanding of a particular leadership trait? Yeah.
That's a wonderful question. I could, ask you to enroll in a semester-long class about that here, about leadership. But let me give you the hopefully 2-minute answer here, which is a theory paper I'm actually working on that I just submitted tries to break down that elephant analogy into 5 specific buckets. And to be clear, we're not trying to redefine leadership with a new theory. We're just trying to say everything we know about leadership takes one of these 5 perspectives. And to really understand leadership in the real world, we need to look at leadership from all 5 perspectives. So each of these represents the ear and the tail and so forth. And very quickly, the 5 are features. We're arguing that leadership depends on individual differences. Some people just have different personalities or skill sets that enable them to be a good leader. But that's not the only perspective. A lot of research only focuses on that's not the only. The next one is function. Leaders have to enact certain behaviors, certain actions that engage in leadership. But that's not it. They also have to look at the third one, fit. Leadership depends on the situation and context that you're in. Certain behaviors and certain personalities and certain skills matter more or less depending on the team that you're working on, depending on the industry, depending on the time. Fourth, form. We're arguing that leadership also depends on the structure that you have in place. Whether that's a very traditional hierarchical, one person in charge calling all the shots structure, or a more shared structure, we got several people working together to enact leadership, or even a vaguely defined non-hierarchical structure where you have a leaderless team and with no predefined leader. And that really changes how you lead. And then fifth and finally, focus. We're arguing that leadership is often through the lens of the follower. And there's a lot of research on this area of followership theory, saying that we should be defining leadership based on how followers perceive the leader. And in some ways, the follower is more important than the leader itself. And again, our argument here is that in order to really understand leadership, we need to look at it from all 5 perspectives simultaneously.
Great. So next question from Allison. She asked, can kind of the forced choice measure be used to generate good/accurate survey data, or can the results be compromising in certain ways? And also she makes a remark that like cross-disciplinary research are super interesting, so keep up the good work.
Thanks. Yeah, and one of the benefits at CMC actually on that note is because it's a small school, I get to interact with people from other areas. I came from my PhD at George Mason University, where the benefit was we had 10 faculty for organizational psychology alone, but it meant that I barely talked to the clinical psych faculty or to the developmental psych faculty, let alone outside of psychology. I pushed and got permission to take that certificate and take classes in computational sciences, which is what built up my data science experience. But that wasn't normal at a large university where you really get silos. And to be fair, that's not true at all large universities. But my point is at CMC, I regularly hang out with and am friends with and interact with people in philosophy, in machine learning and data science, in so many different departments. So I really appreciate that at CMC and I'm encouraged by that. To the question on forced choice methodology, yes, it's been very interesting. Most of the focus on forced choice research has been this idea of validity. Does it actually predict what we want to predict? And usually we're saying, does it predict job performance? That's what we're most interested in from a selection setting in terms of hiring. And the research is generally suggesting that yes, it actually predicts job performance pretty much about as well as your traditional 1 to 5 test. Which is, I'm not saying it perfectly predicts it, to be clear. We know from decades and decades of research, personality does predict job performance, but not that much. But we're saying that the comparison of forced choice to scale of 1 to 5 is pretty equal on the validity prediction. However, there's different now ongoing research, and actually to your follow-up question, Allison, on different ways of asking the forced choice question. I don't know if there's been a study specifically on the not applicable choice, But one that just came out maybe a year ago that's been really hot topic now is rather than ranking, it's putting them on actually a scale, but it's saying, do you lean this way or do you lean that way? It's called a graded forced choice response. And the idea is just giving them more options. So it reduces the factor, the fact that people look at it and say, I don't want to rank these two, and makes them say, I'm more likely, I lean towards this. People tend to be more comfortable with that. And so there's been some recent work using those types of survey methods to try to retain the same amount of validity while also reducing the negative reaction that we get from participants.
Oh, great. So next up, Rick, he said that a number of us at our company took a survey called the Discovery Insight Survey of Personality, and they found it like very kind of accurate in how like it describes people. And so he wants to ask, kind of, have you all done with kind of work with these type of survey to investigate kind of the integration of different personality and team composition and kind of the implication of these survey across performance?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll admit I don't know that particular company. There are many companies that produce personality tests for those that are interested. The ones that I'm personally familiar with, and I can say that I know people who have worked on them, researchers who have built them, or places like the Hogan personality test. That's a very popular one in my field of study. Um, it's interesting because those of us in academia actually surprisingly sometimes have a harder time getting data from private companies that sell personality tests. Needless to say, it's private data, so it's a little bit harder for us to work with the data. And so that sometimes makes it more difficult for us in academia to really speak to what's happening in the private personality test industry. So I can't speak to the benefits and or challenges of some of these tests that are out there. I'll say just three large things. Three big things is the first is there are a lot of good ones out there. There are plenty of researchers like myself who go on in industry settings and are employed to develop high quality personality tests. And it's a great job. It's a great career path. I'm encouraged by it. And I know a lot of people who do that. And so there are probably plenty of these really solid personality tests out there that you at an organization can get consulting for, and be a client to. But the second is I would just warn that a lot of personality tests capitalize on something called the Barnum effect in psychology. This idea of if you write a generic enough positive sounding statement, people are likely to say, oh, that sounds good, that's true. That there's a way to use language to, I hate to use the word trick people into thinking that you have a good test, but it kind of is in some ways. And to be very clear, I'm not claiming any particular provider out there does this. I don't want to ever get in trouble for saying that. I'm just saying that that does tend to happen. That there's a reason people like taking the Hogwarts test on BuzzFeed because it sounds applicable to them because of that Barnum effect. And the third is I really want anybody taking surveys to be trained in the basic concepts of survey development to ask the right questions to know if it's a good survey or not. And these are some questions like reliability and validity. I actually built a little worksheet for geared towards people who have never taken a stats class, and I have that on my website. Happy to send it out afterwards. That enables you to ask some basic questions about is this survey reliable? Has it been tested? To challenge anybody trying to sell you a personality test to show you the data, to show you the evidence that this personality test is reliable and is valid and is something that might be appropriate for your workplace setting. And that's something I hope that everybody is able to do, even if you've never taken a stats class, even if you don't care about the personality, but someone's selling it to you, so you should care about the quality of what they're selling to you.
No, that sounds interesting as well. Unfortunately, because it's 4:55, we only have one last kind of questions to be one last question, and that comes from Lauren. And Lauren was asked, to what extent kind of does the existence of these predatory journals contribute to the larger mistrust of kind of science, and that facts that science produces is somehow not real, or at least more debatable?
Yeah, that is my fear. That is my fear as a scientist. That I don't want people. I don't want people to not believe science. I guess is the best way to put it. And it is concerning to me to see a rise in issues of research ethics, whether it's predatory journals or there's some pretty big names out there that have. It's in New York Times. It's in these big journals, big newspapers about some big research scandals that have happened, and it's concerning to me. First of all, I want to make sure that I'm saying it's not everywhere. So this is not saying that everyone's cheating or some kind. That's by far a small slice of the picture. But I would say that small, tiny slice is getting a little bit bigger, and that's concerning. And I want to be able to support, produce research, and train people to be able to identify those issues, to challenge them, to prevent them, and to really make sure our science stands firm. And that's not just connected to predatory journals. I mentioned all sorts of, I mentioned the ethical scandals to next question in the chat. There's publication fees and all sorts of issues of paywalls that are preventing how our research gets transmitted to the public. Because if you didn't know, it often costs you $30 to buy a single research article if you're not affiliated with a university. And universities nowadays are paying millions upon millions of dollars in university contracts so that their faculty can access these journal articles. And there's a whole economic industry here. Now, I'm not an economist. I'm not going to pretend to be able to solve that problem, but I can at least point to it to say that's creating challenges of access, and we need to address that.
Oh, great. Well, I think that's all the time we have today. Thank you again for Professor Zhou and all of you all for joining. It's been very exciting, and all the research that CMC has going on, right? And I'm very lucky that I'm involved with it as well. And also, just a reminder, in fact, next Thursday at the same time on November 20th, there will be another kind of similar talk, also by a professor working in kind of mind area, Professor Inkavi, on value representation in the human brain. So excited for that. Thank you.